She's a native of Ukraine. She grew up there. She came to the U.S. She was a Fulbright scholar. She went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. That's the big campus for those of you who aren't big college football fans, but that's the main campus. And she took a degree, concentration in political science and quantitative and qualitative psychometric measures. Some of you probably know what that means. I'm not sure I can count myself amongst that group. She was referred to us by Dr. Timothy Snyder at Yale. If any of you know of Dr. Snyder, you will know that's a major league reference. He's a big deal. I'm going to say a few comments before Dr. Lennon starts, just to set the big picture. The U.S. faces challenges to three strategic allies that we have. Israel, which is the current focus of attention, obviously, Ukraine, and Taiwan. All are facing deadly enemies and opponents, and our imperative is to support and aid them in their fight for freedom, independence, and security. New York Times today noted that Ukraine worries that a prolonged war in Gaza may deflect public attention from Ukraine. It's clearly taken all the air out of the room right now, as is right, but we do have a long-term commitment there. President Zelensky has reminded us that Ukraine's defense is pivotal for European security. Ukraine is an emblem of the quest for freedom and independence worldwide. Now, my hope here is a famous quote from Churchill, who had many famous quotes, but he said, "In the long run, the Americans will do the right thing after first having tried all other alternatives." So I think we'll get there. And just sort of briefly, and Dr. Lennon is going to give us the full update. In August, Ukraine captured the town of, I hope I'm saying this wrong, I'm probably not, Robotyne, breached the main Russian lines, and it's been a stalemate since. Russia is blockading grain exports in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians are using drones to attack the Russian Navy with some effect, but perhaps you'll have a comment or two on that for us. And without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Olena Lennon from University of New Haven, and you're going to really enjoy this. Thank you, Dr. Lennon.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Good morning. Thank you for having me back. It's been almost a year, a little bit more than a year since I was here last time. I actually checked my notes. I was here on September 18th, a little bit more than a year ago, and at that time, it seemed as though the war was, had to come to an end because of how brutal it had become at that time. And here we are. I wish the circumstances were different, but I'm here to give you an update and hear some of your thoughts and reflections on what's going on, not just in Ukraine, but also in Israel, Gaza in particular, and how those events are interconnected, interrelated. If they are, I believe they are, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts as well. So my goal today is really just kind of recap the events of the last year to the best I can, and without focusing too much on tactical dynamics. It's very dynamic battlefield still. There's a lot of changes every day. It continues to be a hot war. There is no stalemate. There is the moment for negotiations is not pregnant as we have been expecting it for the last year. So there's a lot going on, but I kind of want to focus on bigger things. And try and kind of give you some of my thoughts as far as where this is headed, and what are some of the possible scenarios for resolution, especially now that the United States has obligations, moral, humanitarian, and strategic obligations to support Israel and Ukraine at the same time, to ramp up defense aid, and also increase ammunition production here in the United States. There's a lot going on there, and there's a lot more pressure, obviously, on the United States to support both Israel and Ukraine at the same time. But I think the one thing that I'm going to start with is that as I speak to you today, and I always make that disclaimer, without sort of any expectations that people may be familiar with my background, but I am from Eastern Ukraine originally, but I'm a naturalized American citizen. So I speak to you as a Ukrainian American, but also as a scholar of international relations and war, and somebody who's been tracking this war personally and professionally for the last 9 years. And just to sort of remind people once again that, as much as we've heard over the last few weeks that this will be a lone war, this has been a lone war, as it has gone on for 9 years almost. So this started in 2014. My hometown in Eastern Ukraine has been occupied for 8 years now, 9 years in fact. So this is one of the longest wars on the European continent already. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we continue describing this war as something that has the potentiality of being a lone war, forgetting that this didn't start in 2022. This started at least in 2014, if not in 1991, when Russia was fundamentally in disagreement with Ukraine's independence and Belarus, Georgia, and other former Soviet republics. So the war against Ukraine's sovereignty and independence has continued for 30 years, and it has escalated to sort of genocidal levels. But where we're at right now, so let me just give you a brief recap as far as what the state of play is now to situate my remarks in the context of the current battlefield dynamics. And the reason I think it's important to focus on battlefield dynamics because currently political positions are still negotiated on the battlefield. And everybody knows, and I'm sure Churchill has a lot of great quotes regarding how wars are decided at a negotiating table, and in the end, wars are a contest of wills, and wars are a contest of endurance, but with the understanding that eventually negotiations will have to take place. Currently, political positions are still being refined on the battlefield, so it matters who has advantage on the battlefield right now, and which side can resupply the front lines faster, because that will determine Ukraine's and Russia's negotiating positions in the future. So Russia currently controls about 15% of the Ukrainian territory. Ukraine executed a few successful counteroffensive operations last year, but since then liberated parts of Kherson and Kharkiv region. But the much anticipated counteroffensive that started in June of this year has been quite slow and has not necessarily generated as much progress as was expected. And part of it was because Russia had now almost a year to dig in. So the Ukrainian forces are up against heavily mined fields and deeply entrenched Russian forces without any air support. So I think it's important to keep in mind, as much as Western military analysts focus on combined arms operations, tactical maneuvering, and properly training Ukrainian forces, I think everybody's sort of the general understanding is that all of those things are great, but they're only executable. Those counteroffensive operations are only executable with proper air support, which Ukraine does not have. No NATO military would have ever attempted anything that the Ukrainian military is currently trying to achieve without air support. So I think there's some very real limitations there to what Ukrainian forces can accomplish and how much ground then they can gain. But they've exceeded expectations, that much is clear, and they're continuing to push through. As the United States remains the largest provider of military aid to Ukraine. However, if you kind of factor in refugee costs, social welfare costs, energy and infrastructure costs, and Europeans, I would say, bear the brunt of the burden, even though they're not contributing as much as the United States has contributed in terms of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. But given the outflow of Ukrainian refugees alone into neighboring countries, that is a substantial cost on our European partners. So I know the conversation about burden sharing sometimes gets really tricky, as here in the United States, in the pre-election campaign, more and more conversations revolve around, Europeans having to do more, having to pick up the slack, and burden sharing is not properly calibrated. But again, it's all kind of in the context of other costs that the Europeans might have absorbed in larger proportions. So in addition to battlefield dynamics, and then there's still very, very much the ongoing battles are a combination of artillery duels and very close quarter combat, urban warfare going street by street and clearing every square meter of territory. In addition to that, Russia has continued leveraging airstrikes against civilians. And this is kind of where Russia has been trying to compensate for their military underperformance by putting additional pressure on the Zelensky administration by striking energy infrastructure, residential areas, shopping malls, hotels. Recently, they've executed attacks specifically on places where foreign journalists congregate, places where humanitarian aid is distributed. So these are, violations of, not just rules of law, rules of war, but also, these are blatant terrorist attacks that target civilians. So what the war has come down to is, to quote two prominent military experts, Rob Lee and Mike Kaufman, the war has come down to a balance of attrition over time, which side has more reserves, and who can better manage their combat power in a prolonged war. So this will be, we're in it for a long haul, but what's important to emphasize is that, how things are escalating. I think this is a really important conversation because for a very long time, American policymakers and our European partners have used this sort of excuse, I would say, that providing Ukraine with longer-range munitions or with fighter jets or with more advanced capabilities would be escalatory, that Russia would be triggered to cross the nuclear threshold or to perhaps escalate violence to a level that could spill over to a NATO territory. Well, none of that has happened, and so that sort of logic has worn off and sort of almost invalidated itself because the only room for escalation that's left to Russia is nuclear. And currently, they have escalated to every possible level in terms of punishing Ukrainian civilians. No part of Ukrainian territory has been spared Russian attacks, even as far west as Lviv, where I was just a week ago, where, just a few weeks ago, there were strikes right, in broad daylight downtown Lviv, which is only, a short car ride away from the Polish border. It's about 2 hours away from Poland. So this is how close it has come to NATO territory. So the bottom line is that Russia's room for escalation has shrunk to where providing Ukraine with more advanced capabilities that will allow it to strike deeper into Russia-held territories will not necessarily trigger anything new that we have not seen before. And this is the new reality that we're faced with as American foreign policymakers are sort of grappling with how to calibrate escalation dynamics properly. I think it's becoming more and more clear that it's very unlikely that Russia will resort to the use of nuclear weapons, even in theater, tactical nuclear weapons that could potentially augment their conventional forces and allow them to dig in deeper or hold more terrain in Ukraine. So, and the reason for that, the White House, the Biden administration has assessed recently that yes, nuclear escalation remains a threat, and Putin's appetite for risk is very high. So the combination of Russia's conventional forces underperforming and being heavily depleted on the battlefield, and the fact that Russia's casualties mount every day in unimaginable proportions. Putin continues to signal high tolerance levels for cost and a high appetite for risk. And that combination of factors is very dangerous as Putin continues to push through, and the hope is, on his part, is to outlast the West. So what he believes in is that he can, that the Russians, regardless of how much they have paid, they will still endure longer than Western support for Ukraine, because Ukraine means more to Russia than it does to the West. And that is the calculus that Putin relies on. The reason we believe that it's unlikely that Putin will resort to nuclear escalation is because of China and India. Russia has relied heavily on China's and India's economic support. India now is the largest buyer of Russian energy, enjoying the discount, and they've been able to prop up the Russian economy and allow the Russian forces to rebuild themselves, albeit slowly. So, does that mean that there are prospects for negotiations? Nope. Even the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the key diplomats in the UN and in foreign governments that have been pushing for negotiations, even the more optimistic negotiation sort of oriented experts see no prospects for any talks right now, as the war is still very dynamic. And most importantly, there are two main factors that are in play here. And they are that both sides, Russia and Ukraine, believe that victory is achievable and defeat is unacceptable. So good luck to all of us. In that predicament, no side perceives negotiations to be beneficial to their ultimate outcome, as even minimal objectives have not been achieved. Important context here too is that Russian presidential elections are coming up in March 2024, and even though these are not real elections, but nonetheless, United Russia party, Putin's party, and Putin himself are obviously going to try and produce results. They need to generate some victorious narratives leading up to the election. And one of Putin's strategies to consolidate gains in Ukraine and to deliver some sort of a victory for his domestic audience is to sort of annex these 4 regions that were occupied since 2014, but also more recently in 2022, that Russia is currently controlling, to really intensify population control. So there is forced passportization in play right now. They're really trying to convert any remaining Ukrainian citizens in occupied territories into Russian citizens very, very quickly and very forcefully. I know from my friends' accounts and my family's accounts who unfortunately have had to remain in some of those occupied territories that it's not a choice anymore. Everybody who wants to survive has to get a Russian passport. And that is part of it, this very reminiscent of Soviet tactics of population control in sort of this producing loyal populations and generating a sizable contingent of voters who will likely cast votes for Putin in 2024 and who will be eligible to vote. But it's also a way of disrupting Ukraine's political processes and denying Ukraine its sovereignty and cohesion. Having these sort of disputed territories obviously doesn't serve Ukraine, occupied territories, and having Ukrainian citizens converted into Russian citizens is not only genocidal by definition, but obviously sets Ukraine back on what it is trying to achieve. Not to mention, and I think this is one of the more sort of horrific outcomes of the war so far, is how children have been treated. It's something that I've been involved in, the research that I've done and groups that I've worked with on identifying and repatriating Ukrainian children, victims of war, whether they were orphaned or children from war zones. The Russian officials, present this as they've been saving Ukrainian children. They are, extracted from frontline towns and transferred to Russian schools and medical facilities. Also, teenagers undergo military training, and so they're being re-educated, retrained to become, Russian patriots. So again, this is genocide by definition. The International Criminal Court, as you know, indicted Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, his commissioner for children's rights, so to speak, for war crimes. So Putin is now an indicted war criminal. But the most ironic and also paradoxical aspect of that indictment is that it was self-incriminating. There was so much evidence of Russia transferring Ukrainian children to Russia because they bragged about it on TV. They put up Ukrainian children for adoption. They simplified adoption procedures to make it easier for Russian families to adopt Ukrainian children. And then again, that screams, by international law, that screams genocide. It's a major war crime. But this is just further proof that we live in parallel universes. That is just absolutely no way to get through to the Kremlin's leaders and convince them of anything, really, because there's no baseline. There's no recognition that deporting children of war to the opposite side is a major war crime. All right, so I want to talk about Israel, without kind of trying to comment so much on the dynamics of the war itself and the military operations and the sort of ongoing offensives on Gaza and some of the decisions that were made there. I'm not a Middle Eastern expert, but I do want to talk about the Israel model for Ukraine, because it has been discussed for a while now. And I think now that violence has escalated in Israel, and it is a new front opened up, in fact, it's not just escalation, as Netanyahu said, it's a war, we're at war, and I think we should use those terms. But I wanted to kind of try and connect the Israel model, so to speak, with America's assistance to Ukraine, and to point out that as tempting as it might be to draw parallels between Israel's war against Iran-backed militant groups and Ukraine's war against Russia, there are two different problem sets for the U.S. And they require simultaneous problem solving. So the U.S. isn't as the greatest power. American national security strategy, in fact, is calibrated to be ready for two simultaneous conventional wars. We haven't found ourselves in that predicament yet, but I think we're nearing that point where the U.S. Will have to find resources to sustain both Ukraine and Israel in their respective fights. The common denominator there is, of course, Russia. Russia is a global disruptor. Russia is one of the main destabilizing state actors. Russia's support of Hamas is well documented. Russia's increasing cooperation with Iran is also well documented, because it is entirely thanks to Iran that Russia has been able to sustain airstrikes against Ukrainian infrastructure and civilians. They're running out of missiles, we believe is what is happening, and they can't rebuild precision-guided missiles as quickly because of sanctions. What they have been using instead, they've been attacking Ukraine on the cheap. They deploy these cheap Iranian drones that strike Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. And even though most of them get intercepted, even the debris alone do a lot of damage and still kill people, including in capital city, Kiev and in large centers. So, and that is almost more dangerous because of how cheap these capabilities are. So this has become a drone warfare in many ways, and Ukrainians are now leading in terms of innovating the drone technology. But the limitation that the Ukrainians have is that they've been using drones to execute attacks on the Russian territory. They haven't, it's not, they're unattributed attacks. Obviously, they haven't necessarily disclosed that. But, Ukrainians would benefit from American-made drones, more sophisticated drones, but right now they are under very strict guidelines to not use any American weapons to strike into Russia proper. And that remains a key limitation that, doesn't make sense to a lot of people because Russia and Ukraine are at war. And, absolutely Russia launches attacks on Ukraine from the Russian territory, but Ukraine cannot retaliate and actually strike Russia proper with American weapons. Although Crimea is fair play because it's Ukrainian, official Ukrainian territory. So the bottom line here is that supporting Israel and Ukraine at the same time is an imperative that the U.S. has to embrace because of Russia's direct or indirect involvement in supporting Iran, cooperating with Iran as a key enabler of Hamas, but also enabling Hamas and other, Hezbollah and other militant organizations around the globe as a way of disrupting the status quo, as a way of imposing multiple dilemmas on the West. So absolutely, Russia is a common denominator. I don't think that Russia was directly involved in coordinating these attacks. So that's a whole different sort of operation. But for the U.S., I think, as much as the U.S. has commitments to both Ukraine and Israel, they're calibrated very differently. But I think strategically, undermining the cooperation between Iran and Russia is as relevant in the Ukraine theater as it is in the Israel theater. So that is absolutely the case. So the reason the Israel model may not necessarily be applicable to Ukraine is because, for Israel, really, it's maintaining qualitative edge that is decisive. So it has, much more sophisticated air defense systems, the Iron Dome. It also receives more sophisticated weaponry from the U.S. The U.S.'s support for Israel is ongoing, and it has, solid, robust infrastructure. For Ukraine right now, it's both quantitative and qualitative advantage. So Ukraine needs more stuff and faster. It's a very different war, and unfortunately, one of the key limitations in the U.S.'s ability to resupply Ukraine is, logistics. It's very difficult to get all the ammunition and equipment to the front lines fast enough, given that it's a no-fly zone, and then equipment and logistic hubs get frequently attacked by Russia. So this will be or has been a long war. So what does that mean? And I just want to kind of talk a little bit about, what it means to be in a long war, or the fact that we have been in a long war. How does it end, right? Tell me how this ends. The two things that Americans have to figure out right now is not just how to provide security assistance to Ukraine, that's the short term, but how to provide security guarantees to where Ukraine can defend itself against any future aggression, but also Ukraine as one way or the other, de facto or de jure, eastern flank of NATO. Even though the last summit in Vilnius made it clear that there is no consensus in NATO on accepting Ukraine into its ranks in the foreseeable future, I think that is currently off the table for as long as the hot war lasts. But eventually, some sort of a security guarantee has to be configured to make sure that Russia is denied an ability to achieve their foreign policy objectives by force. So that's not going to go away. Is this resorting to conventional forces to achieve political objectives should be a fundamental change in the Russian thinking, and that is going to be much more difficult to accomplish, and probably will require some sort of a regime change in Russia. Until that transpires, so whenever that happens, Ukraine must receive security guarantees, not just assistance. So the current answer is that the U.S. is able to sustain Ukraine's war effort, but the challenges are that it just cannot ramp up its production fast enough, and the Europeans also don't have the industrial base adequate enough for wartime production. So those are major limitations. Currently, the Ukrainian military commanders and political leaders estimate that even though Western partners have scaled up support to where now they're providing longer range missiles, ATACMS, these long range missiles have been approved. Cluster munitions, very controversial decision that the Biden administration made, but nonetheless, cluster munitions are now in use by the Ukrainian forces. They have approved F-16s. Pilots are now being trained in Eastern Europe, close to Ukraine. But all these decisions now, the U.S. is now kind of, and France, the UK, and other NATO members are now catching up to these pledges of support. But the unfortunate reality is that there are very significant time gaps. So the things that Ukraine needs now to retain this momentum and to not just hold the ground, but also liberate territory and deny Russia an ability to dig in deeper and convert more Ukrainians into Russian citizens, or even worse, execute ethnic cleansing, is that the things that Ukraine needs now should have been provided a year ago. Given the time it takes to train, maintain equipment, and so on and so forth. So I think there's one thing that we have learned is that it's really hard to compensate for the passage of time. Certain decisions have to be put in place at the right time to trigger other decisions. Delaying decision making now will not lead us to the future that we want in 10, 15 years. So for the future that we want, the strategy, the strategic vision that we have now for Ukraine's role in Europe, for its place in European security architecture, also all those decisions, if you deconstruct them, result in or require very strong decisive actions now. And there's no way to make up for that. There's no way to accelerate those decisions later. So what I see time and again as I hear these conversations of how we should respond, what other sort of escalation we need, that I recognize that unfortunately this sort of indecisiveness will be costly again, as for many Ukrainians and many of my friends who are teachers, doctors, lawyers, and journalists who are now soldiers, because they didn't have a choice, are saying we must fight now, because if we lose this momentum and if we allow Russia to advance, then our children will be fighting the same war in 5 to 10 years. There's absolutely no indication that Russia's plans have changed, that Russian leadership or that regime is fracturing. So any delay in decision-making will be much more consequential down the road. And then we're seeing the results of that now. Now it's almost 2 years now, and again, one of the main reasons why the Ukrainian forces have not been able to launch a more successful counteroffensive was because they're lacking things that they didn't receive, they didn't have a year ago. So lastly, and I'll just kind of kind of summarize or broaden the perspective, I think that one of the other impediments to a successful resolution of the war is the fact that, okay, Western alignment is strong, but so is non-Western non-alignment. We have major players such as India, China, Turkey, that sort of embrace this type of foreign policy, this multi-vector foreign policy that is briefly summarized as pro-Ukraine but not anti-Russia. Especially China and India, again, continue to buy energy from Russia. We're watching China very closely. The US is watching China very closely because there's allegations that they might be providing Russia with lethal assistance, and that will be a red line. So Turkey has played a key role in prisoner of war exchanges and negotiating the grain deal, getting the grain out of Ukrainian ports. But they still haven't joined the sanctions regime. Turkey has so far resisted that imperative, and they're kind of continuing to position themselves as potentially serving as or playing the role of a mediator in Russia-Ukraine negotiations. So the Turkey's position is maintaining neutrality to be a peace broker. But again, currently, all that does is sustains Russia's economy and allows Russia to rebuild its combat power. I'll skip over some of these key players and just emphasize that the political will, the will to fight, political resolve are still strong in Ukraine. The most recent public opinion polls show that the Ukrainians remain resilient, optimistic. Of course, it comes at a huge price, as a quarter of the population has been displaced, and living conditions are dire. It still remains a major humanitarian catastrophe. But the level of national unity is still remarkable. I was just in Ukraine a week ago, and it still remains the most inspirational place on earth, in my opinion, in terms of how committed people are to this cause, and how much clarity they have as far as what they're up against and what they must do, and it's really remarkable. The key factors to watch are, of course, American elections. Everybody is bracing for American elections. I think people outside America probably talk about American elections in more constructive terms because it will affect everybody. I think we're really sort of entertaining the possibility of change of leadership in the U.S., and that is expected to affect levels of support for Ukraine. Luckily, the United States has, our government is set up in a way to allow to have other sort of ways of delivering or assisting our partners overseas. But obviously, the congressional gridlock will be a key barrier in providing sustainable support to Ukraine. So I'll end on that note, and would like to hear your comments, questions, concerns. Thank you so much for your attention, and hopefully we'll have some audience participation now. Yes.